welcome everyone. Good to meet you. I've met many of you before through the IB community. I worked for the IB for 8 years as the head of MYP development and then as head of DP development. So I've been involved in the IB as a teacher, coordinator, vice principal, etc., as well as working for the IB. And a lot of what I'll talk about in the next 30, 40 minutes is based on what I've learned from my time working in the IB, and since then working in many, many schools and observing what happens around the world. We're going to really consider the idea of what global citizenship is, and I'm certainly not going to tell you what it is. I'm hoping that you will make up your own mind based on the background that I give. We'll look at how maybe curriculum really links to global citizenship and back and forth there, and then think about the possibility of using sustainable development goals to advance global citizenship. Now, first of all, a lot of you, of course, will have talked about international mindedness for years and years and years. In fact, international mindedness since about 2010 has been on each of the IB's program models, the wheels, the various colored wheels. Of course, the MYP model is salmon colored. The IB don't officially call it salmon, but I do. So you can call it whatever you like, orange, red, whatever. But the whole point of an IB education is to develop young people who are internationally minded. But how do we do that? And a great phrase from Jeff Thompson and Mary Hayden at Bath University many years ago was, is it caught or is it taught? Do we teach students international mindedness? Or is it something that just happens to them because they're on the playground, they're in classrooms, they're in labs, they're on sports events with children from around the world with different views, perspectives, and backgrounds? So is it caught or is it taught? And I should say at this point as well, international mindedness is a uniquely IB term. I think it was Dr. Ian Hill that created the term many, many years ago, but nobody really knows that. But it's a uniquely IB term. And we did think a lot back at the IB, back in the days, about 2008 or 9, we were talking with each other, as often happens at the IB, about whether or not we should move from international mindedness to global citizenship to global competence or whatever. And it was decided really that international mindedness has become the IB term and that we should stick with it. But the IB really believes that if your students can demonstrate the attributes of the learner profile, that they are demonstrating international mindedness. But did the IB ever define it? Well, it didn't, not for many, many years. Eventually, in 2012, with the publishing of What is an IB Education, after using the term for many, many years, the IB did eventually define it. And there are, I think, 4 main pieces come out of the definition. It's about inquiry and local and global issues. It's thinking about perspective, cultural identity, multilingualism, and the idea of service or some kind of engagement with the community. So I will keep returning to these points as we go through. So if you break down what international mindedness is, bearing in mind its similarity with ideas of global competence and global citizenship, if we believe, and I believe, that it can be taught, and it's not just going to be caught in the playground, then what should our curriculum look like if it is going to develop these traits? Other ideas that are coming out at the moment, and of course, Veronica Boyks-Mansisha at Harvard Project Zero, and many others are looking at global competence and some great work going on there. And again, 4 key areas that come out, and you'll see trends coming out as we look at different angles. Knowledge and understanding of international issues. Okay, so going back to what we said before about perspectives. So perspectives, international issues. Working with people from diverse cultural backgrounds. Again, we saw that before. Multilingualism, different perspectives, inquiry. You'll see the same themes coming up. Proficiency in a world language, we had multilingualism before, and skills to function. And we'll talk a bit about skills shortly. The United World Schools is a great organization, and I would encourage any school to look them up and think, how can we become involved with them? They set up schools to help children that wouldn't otherwise have an education. So look them up. But how do they see what a global citizen is. And for them, it's about living sustainably and tackling social justice. It's about being open, curious, taking action towards equity. So you see more of a social justice side to this. That's their take on it. And the reason I'm showing you these kind of things is that there is no one answer. There's no one statement. There are many, many definitions out on the internet if you care to look for them about what global citizenship is, but it's actually made up of many, many facets. Way back in the day, my friend Simon Scoons at Ishmael in Ho Chi Minh City would remind you, the UK, believe it or not, was leading, world leading, not just in vaccines, not just in track and trace, but the UK was world leading in its thinking about global citizenship back in the late 2000s, early 2000s, that era. And I think Oxfam came up with some great thoughts on what global citizenship is for education at that time. Again, it comes down to knowledge and skills. But look at the bullet points here. Really interesting to see, again, respect and values, just what the United World Schools were saying there. Understanding of how the world works. Again, going back to the ideas of inquiry and local and global issues. And again, the overlap with social justice. Outraged by social justice. I love that. How about in our MYP classrooms, if we can allow students the opportunity to inquire into something that is outraging them, it's horrible, they can't imagine the world is like this, and they then want to do something. And of course, as we know, any great inquiry should result in some kind of an action where there's a change of behavior or a change in the community. And that's where the learning takes place. It's not all that academic part of the learning. It's what can we do beyond the classroom to change our behavior, to change the behavior of others. And you'll see how it's the involvement of community. And you'll be seeing already with these few slides, there's a big connection with service, action, and what we can do in our communities, and the idea of sustainable communities and being a more compassionate person. So having thought about just those quick definitions, I've whizzed through areas that I think are really interesting, useful to look at. And I'm certainly not going to give you a definition because there's dozens of them out there. How would you define global citizenship? And please do use the chat box. Chris has nipped outside to just enjoy a few moments of sunshine, but she will be back in from the sunshine just to, I say that because I'm resentful at the weather that I've got. Chris will have come in from the sunshine, which is hitting the right side of her face beautifully, and will be monitoring what you say. But I'd be really interested to hear, how would you define global citizenship? It's not an IB term as such, but it is certainly something that we as educators who believe in making the world a better place should have on our minds. And thinking about the fact that I don't think we should leave it to chance. We shouldn't leave it to chance for it to be caught in the classroom or caught in the playground or on the way home. It's something that we can deliberately, explicitly teach and plan for. So what do you think global citizenship is? Have we got any coming through, Chris?
We've got lots of ideas popping into the room. We've got Amal is talking about all nations having the same rights. And Pragati talks a little bit about your role as the individual in the world, which is really important because students get, especially MYP students, get a sense of the global things that we show them, especially through nonfiction reading. And sometimes they don't realize that the child sitting next door to them in the class is actually experiencing hunger as well, bringing it really there to the local. So knowing how to take action to solve a problem, because they can talk a really good game, but then how do you actually go through the steps? Nancy's talking a little bit about the ability to adapt to other cultures, countries, and peoples, and how that's encountered in their own life without reverting to their own understandings. I think that's a really poignant way of putting it. And Stephanie's talking about her love of the emphasis on social justice in these definitions. Looks like she's got a sizable overseas experience, and she talks to being a global citizen that involves understanding your privilege and responsibility to work for equity and inclusion for all. And that's a really powerful statement given the state of the world that we have for our young men and women that are in our MYP classrooms. And Rhonda's talking to that, knowing how to navigate a diversity of ways of communicating and interpreting actions. That's really, especially when you're dealing with middle school students who react in the moment. You know, your 14-year-olds that you know, get incensed and outraged, and then, you know, as time goes on, that kind of drops off really quick. How do they communicate and interpret that? And thinking of how problems are in different countries. Chat windows exploding with lots of different ideas and understandings in terms of what it is to be a global citizen.
Hopefully all of those ideas will be available to everybody beyond this session, because ultimately how we view global citizenship will, I think Nancy really hit the nail on the head there with it as well. It does depend on our context a lot. It depends on the students in front of us, and it depends in our context, where we are in the world and where we are within our communities. Thanks, everybody. Now, you remember at least two of the definitions I shared before talked about skills, but which skills? And people are always talking about, yeah, we can throw out all the phrases you like, ATL skills, of course, 21st century soft skills, whatever. But which skills are important? If you want to develop a global citizen, and I think the previous slides have shown you that skills are important, we must therefore plan them into our curriculum. Because the world is changing. The world is changing rapidly in all sorts of ways. Our job demands have changed. The role of AI is changing the way that we are and the way that we interact. The climate challenge is probably the biggest challenge to face the world once we got through the pandemic challenge and poverty challenges and so on. So we've got a lot of challenges in the world, which mean that we need to focus on a number of skills. So this is very, very old list, but again, you can go on LinkedIn or Google and you can get 100 of these different lists if you like. The reason I use this list is because when we were rewriting the ATL component of the MYP back in 2010, 11, 12, this is part of the research that went into the work we did for devising ATL at that point. And it's the idea that really in the future, students will have to have that focus on things like critical thinking, problem solving skills, collaboration, working diverse teams, right? Think of that, the ability to work in diverse teams, collaboration across networks. How often do we deliberately, explicitly teach students about the say media literacy, the etiquette and the skills of collaborating in an online environment? As we know now, every workplace is pretty much based on to some degree, some kind of electronic communication. And sometimes different people that you're communicating with have different expectations depending on where they are or how they were brought up or even when they went through their education experience. So there's a lot to think about here, but which skills are the most important ones to be teaching? Now, this is a little hark back to my days when I worked at NIST in Thailand back in the, from 1999 to 2007. If there's anyone here who worked at NIST at that time, hello. Frank was a wonderful student of mine, aged 11, back in 2001. And I was the ATL coordinator back then. And I was asked to create a load of booklets. And Frank volunteered to create the front page of each of the booklets. And we used 5 categories of ATL skills, which, funnily enough, are the 5 categories that we have now, because we pinched those from the PYP. And this was his image for communication skills. So anyway, many, many years later, I contacted Frank again, because I thought, let's see what he thinks of ATL. So I contacted him. He works now for Apple, I believe, in California. He's done very well. And I said, what do you think about the importance of ATL now? And Frank actually said, what you're on about, I've no idea what ATL is. So of course I refreshed his mind and asked for his permission to use this picture. Once I'd explained again what ATL was, this was exactly what he said, which is it's really interesting. Now, do we think that in the way that we plan skills, the ATL skills in our lessons, are we helping students to do this kind of thing? Persuade. This is my idea. This is my product. This is what you want. This is what you need. You know, I do know that in language and literature and language acquisition, to some extent, we do talk about presenting for audiences or writing in a particular genre, persuasive writing, argumentative writing, and so on. But think about this. We've got to help students to be able to have dialogue across cultural parts of the world, different cultures. We're going to have people able to talk in different languages, as we said earlier, but also have the ability to persuade and argue in an effective way. So this is what Frank, all those years later, actually believes is important. So are we teaching them, and where do we teach them? Now, of course, we do deliberately and explicitly teach a lot of ATL skills within the subjects, of course, and it happens quite naturally a lot of the time because the subject objectives enable that to happen. But it's so important, those ones that come outside the classroom. I honestly believe from my days working at NIST and other places, it's those outdoor education moments. I think every child should have at least one outdoor ed event per year, at least one trip to the theatre or an art gallery, at least one trip to a sports event. You know, this is where they develop the character and the skills that they really need for the future. So it's stuff that goes on outside the classroom, whether it's the arts, the sports area, outdoor ed, that's important. Or indeed separate lessons. You might have mindfulness lessons or research skills. These are all important, but it's so crucial that we put the skills first and foremost in what we think about. But there's the attributes as well. If you think about what was said in those various places before, what about the attributes? Now, the IB has listed 10, and we all know what they are in the learner profile. I would argue that being open-minded is probably the most important of them in terms of global citizenship, but you could argue for any, really, couldn't you? Principled, caring, of course, so important to become a global citizen. But where do they come? You know, the PYP was designed around the student profile, as it was then called. The DP and the MYP essentially in 2006 had the learner profile dropped on them, and teachers had to start thinking about this. But there's no structure within the programs to actually deliberately teach them. But can you teach somebody to be, for example, resilient, compassionate, open-minded? Can you teach someone to be caring? Or do you teach a range of skills and strategies that enable someone to get there? Or is it about providing the opportunity? And that goes back to the previous slide, where the opportunity may come from service learning opportunities, sports, the arts, and so on, outside the classroom. So my point I'm making is, yes, we should be teaching these skills and giving students opportunity in classes, but an education is so much more than what happens in the classroom. And I like to look back at what Fullen says here, the Fullen 6 Cs, and this has been reimagined in a paper just less than a year ago in light of COVID, but the 6 global competencies that learners need to flourish in the world. And I would argue that 2 of the 6 Cs are attributes and 4 are skill sets. Character and citizenship being attributes, collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking being skill sets. How much do you, in your education at the school, consider these 6? How can we provide opportunity for character building and citizenship, whilst at the same time ensuring that our ATL focus is on collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking? As we think about attributes, as I said, being open-minded, for example, can you teach somebody to be open-minded? Or is it about providing the opportunities in class and outside class for students to demonstrate that they are open-minded? So my next challenge to you, and this is where the chat box comes in, and hopefully Chris will have to deal with hundreds of ideas coming in from you now. Do you explicitly plan, teach, and assess the skills and attributes for global citizenship? To what extent do you do that? Think of those 6 Cs from Fullen. Do you explicitly and deliberately plan for character and citizenship? Do you deliberately and explicitly plan, teach, assess around, say, communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking? Because if that is the route to the skills and attributes required for global citizenship, then they need to be deliberately planned for and taught. We can't hope that they're caught on the classroom, on the playground or outside the classroom. So throw your ideas into the chat box. If you do, please tell us what you do, because we all want to learn with each other and from each other. I'm just throwing out the prompts here. We can learn with each other. So please share your ideas and share what you do. Any coming in, Chris?
Yeah, we've got, I mean, I was just even personally reflecting as to how I when I was at my former schools here in the United States, even started something like the Duke of Edinburgh's Award over here. It's called the Young Americans Challenge, and bringing my young men and women out into the backcountry areas of North Georgia was a real insightful time to see the difference between the city community and the rural community. And then they were able to make all sorts of great connections.
I agree. I think the Duke of Edinburgh Award, International Youth Award, as it's also known, Governor General Youth Award in the Bahamas, it's got all sorts of names, but you're right. If kids they have to do volunteering, they have to do something physical, they have to demonstrate skills, they have to do some kind of expedition or hike. This is character and citizenship in bucket loads.
Yeah. And that stimulated a lot of, actually it started with Amal was talking about coding and how he uses problem solving skills to the end of, I'm married to IT, so I know exactly where you're coming from here. I sit and watch that with my husband every single day. And that's the real world many which of our students are going into. Jerry's talking about leadership design sprints, which is actually a real life that's aligned to that whole idea of the agile community. So that's real life.
That's really authentic, isn't it? Brilliant.
Totally. Yeah. So looking at explicitly teaching some of these skills in particular, Stephanie's talking about implicit and explicit, using Model UN, using the Duke of Ed, using external organizations, things even like being part of the scouting organizations for Eagle Scout and those kind of activities as well. PBL, which many schools lean into quite heavily in formal programs, especially here in the United States, but being really true to that experiential learning. Nancy's talking about how that can really help to hone interdisciplinary outreach programs and those co-curricular activities that every school has back there. I love that Hanchel is talking about planning that unit with democracy, so that we're valuing the different perspectives and the great ideas that might come from different teacher interests. So that's where that open-mindedness can really arrive in our collaborative planning time as teachers. Gosh, there's so much here. And encouraging interdisciplinary opportunities for learning. Melanie's leaning into that. And that seems to be a thread, the opportunity to be interdisciplinary. And we have that so explicitly in the MYP as part of who we are and what we do.
I mean, a little aside on this, when we were reviewing the MYP back in the day for the next chapter, it wasn't an entirely facetious thought from my colleague Andy Mays, who's a really fantastic bloke. He's the curriculum manager for design at that time in the MYP, and he proposed that we have at the center of the model for MYP design, then everything else emerges from it, and essentially everything is interdisciplinary. And I do wonder if that kind of an idea is having a resurgence. Do we need to have, we always talked about the blurry lines between the subjects in the MYP. Maybe we need to just go and be a little bit more ambitious and drop those all together. And there are examples from around the world where that happens a little bit more. And I know PBL certainly helps with that. So thank you. Chris, any last thoughts before I head on?
It's interesting that you raised that. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to work with a school here in the United States that thought that very thought that Andrew had back then, and trained all of their teachers in design. Every single teacher in the school trained in design, leaned right into it because they believed that design was everywhere. across the school, and that school's thriving in the interdisciplinary because they can see all of the opportunities now to really manage global citizenship in a city, North American city that is experiencing rapid growth in Austin, Texas.
Yeah.
So in that context, that's an amazing decision to make in context, and schools have the liberty to do that as well. And just it actually rides to a couple of things that Meen was saying about explicitly teaching skills inside of mathematics, and working with the teachers in making sure that subject specific really does make meaningful sense in the IDU. And with the review of the IDU this year, it really does help to lean in quite heavily into creating that opportunity for global contextual and citizenship conversations.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for those of you mentioning the interdisciplinarity. It's crucial. Now, thinking back again about what some of those definitions said at the beginning, they talked about inquiry-based. Now, I'm sure everyone on here is probably on pretty much the same page here, but it comes back to the IB's approaches to teaching. We do believe that it should be a broadly constructivist approach, inquiry-based, through a collaborative and teamwork approach. If we want students to develop the ability to work in diverse teams, to see multiple perspectives, then they need to be working with other young people all the time. And these images really demonstrate what that's about. So inquiry is crucial, but what are they inquiring into? And at least two of the definitions I started with, the ones from Oxfam and the Global Competence, talked about international issues. And what do we mean by international issues? And this is an interesting point. This is from the IB Diploma Geography. You can find, if you look in the IB Diploma Geography or many of the guides, international issues. You can find them. But what about the MYP, which I'm sure many people on here believe is the better of the 4 IB programs? From the moment I joined the IB as head of MYP in 2007, I was told on day one by the Director General, oh, welcome to the MYP, it's the worst program in the IB. It's losing money and it's not very good. And I was told this pretty much every day for many years, which resulted in the review. And I think that many of you will obviously share my views of fondness for the MYP because of the agency that we can enable students to have, and also the teachers and the coordinators and the administrators. It is a wonderful program whereby it is not content free, as many people say, but it is not a prescribed content. So where are the international issues coming from? Where is the international content? If you like to go back to that Oxfam definition, it's coming from us, it's coming from the teachers. So we don't have to reach for a prescribed curriculum there, but where do we get them from? Now, here's a thought. If we want to find international issues, because that's essential for global citizenship, is the answer the 5 Fs? Now, I remember years ago talking about the 3 Fs, flags, food and festivals. I believe we've had folklore and fashion added. But do they really help us to develop global citizenship? They probably do help to a certain extent. I know I used to enjoy the food festivals wherever I was before, largely because I enjoy eating. I don't know whether that's obvious when you've just got head and shoulders, but I do enjoy eating food from many different parts of the world. And I do love a good flag as well. I can name lots of them. But does that really help us to understand global citizenship and to become global citizens? It's limited, it's tokenism, there's a bit of box ticking, but they're fun, there's nothing wrong with them. But we need more, don't we? We need more. We need it incorporated into the very fabric and culture of the school and into the curriculum. And I believe one of the best ways to do this is through the UN SDGs. I'm sure many of you are using the SDGs already. For those of you who are a little bit older, maybe of my vintage, you'll remember the Millennium Development Goals. There were fewer of them. In the planet, we didn't actually achieve the Millennium Development Goals, although we did make some progress. We now have, by 2030, a number of challenges outlined in the SDGs. Each of the 17 SDGs has a number of targets behind each one, and I would encourage you and your colleagues to look at the targets that lie under each one, anywhere between 7 and 19 targets for each SDG. And I believe that this is where, if you want to talk about local and global issues or international issues, this is where they come from. If you want to talk about case studies, compare and contrast over time, across places and across time, then this is where you find them. If we go back to the United World Schools or the Oxfam definitions, we talked about social justice. If you want to introduce social justice case studies, this is where you go. And I would argue that within the MYP structure, we need the SDGs, and you can place them pretty much anywhere. Of course, all sorts of concepts do emerge from them, but I think the biggest value of them is within inquiry, they provide global contexts. If you are looking for explorations to match any particular global context in the MYP, I think this is where you go. You look in the targets for these SDGs and you can find examples. And what happens then is if your students are inquiring into a particular target in one of the SDGs, then they will be able to see how their own action locally can have a global impact. This is where the local and the global, or the glocal, and congratulations to Roma and many of my friends here from the Qatar Foundation who are doing great work on globalization through the SDGs. If you look at what is going on where the students inquire and of their own volition, they want to go out and do something, be it addressing poverty, be it addressing climate action, be it addressing decent work and economic growth, they can see the local and global operating together, and they will want to go out and do something in the community. And I think that this is what we can use as a part of our structure for learning. I would almost bring in the SDGs and place them instead of the explorations. That would be my controversial suggestion. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves about what Oxfam said 13 years ago. If we want students to be outraged by social injustice, you look at SDG 16, freedom and peace and justice. You look at the attacks on freedom of speech that we're seeing at the moment. You look at the attacks on the free press, or if you're looking at the, what's my role in the wider world as a global citizen, as a world citizen? You're looking at all these, you've got to get angry when you look at what's happening in terms of the disparity or gender inequality, or the lack of opportunity for girls across the world. You want students to get outraged and want to do something, and it results in that local and global action. So I think if you look at these bullet points, this I think is the great structure. I know it's quite old, 2008, but if you look at the SDGs and you want to achieve education for global citizenship, I think it's the SDGs along with these 7 bullet points that actually is where the answer lies. So, as I say, MYP, we have agency. We do have many pressures, obviously, to prepare students for wherever they're going next, but we do have a certain amount of leeway to design units that address the needs of young people as they go on into the world. And we want to develop global citizenship. So how would you use the SDGs to develop global citizenship? How can we use the SDGs to promote action and service in the community? Because if you think of your students going out and doing something in their school community or the local community, this is where they're using the skills and developing the attributes that go towards being a global citizen. Think back to your own school days. What do you remember from your school days? It's the trips, it's the service learning, it's things you did outside the classroom. So much of what you can do via the SDGs develops the global citizenship that are the things that students will remember for the rest of their lives. So how can we use these SDGs? Now, there is a blog that goes with this that I wrote, and hopefully a lot of my thoughts here on SDGs, you'll see they're developed a little bit more with a little bit more detail, and hopefully that will enable you to think a little bit further. But at the moment, it's worth thinking about the SDGs. And I'd like to ask you at this point, is anyone using the SDGs? And if so, how And how do you think this works? Do you think the SDGs are useful for developing global citizenship, or are they just, as my line manager told me when I worked at the IB, a passing fad?
It's kind of funny you brought up SDGs and DP geography, because that's my, of course, my subject of choice. I was a DP geography teacher and examiner for a long time. There you go. So but that was the nuts and bolts of what the initial SDGs were way back in the day, when they were the global goals, and now they're the sustainable development goals, and they've morphed into the 17 that we see in front of us now. And they were the nuts and bolts of conversation. And now the chat window is lighting up with Lena is already designing a unit on social change, incorporating the SDGs in the tasks. And these are really easy. I love that you put that alongside the 6 global context explorations, because the ones that are published are just the ones that are exemplars, but you could extract so many more to really meet your school's exploration and context.
By the way, I should tell people here, again, this is like an old war story or something. It's ridiculous. When we were redesigning the MYP back in the day, I sat with the curriculum managers, Andy, Margaret, Sean, and Danielle, in a little glass room, the Montevideo room, actually, in the IB office in The Hague. And we argued for a whole day about context. We said, we know that all learning is contextual. It's contextual, but how do we bring it in and without shoving it in? Oh, how do we do it? And we argued and argued and argued. So inevitably, we did go to the pub and stopped arguing and started chatting. Came back the next morning and went back into the little glass box and said, right, we've got to get this contextual learning right. And how do we do it? So we invited a PYP colleague in and said, this is our problem, what do you think? And she said, oh, just use the transdisciplinary themes. Okay. So within 5 minutes, that problem was solved after a whole day of arguing. And that's where the global context came from.
That's actually what the conversation is going on in the chat window. I mean, Tondarai has just explained how in his school or her school, they have student-driven curriculum time, and the students are working collaboratively to solve a problem around the SDGs. So that might even morph into the students dictating the global context explorations that they're going to use. Of course, Stephanie's talking about personal project. Doesn't that make sense? Personal project is literally driven by a lot of that.
Interesting there as well, what Stephanie's saying and what Tondarai said earlier. By the way, hi, Tondarai. It's in Hyderabad. It's really, really important that this element of choice, this element of agency, because as we talked about developing the attributes, it's about opportunity, and students must have that choice. I mean, what goes back to what you said, Chris, about the teenage brain as well. They've got to have choice. If we want them to be motivated, happy learners who are enjoying learning, then the choice has to be there. And the last 2 examples from Tondarai and Stephanie are spot on.
Yeah, and having that student agency, especially when we're tackling these big global issues, and getting the students to think in that global context, also to drive it down a little bit more into the filter that they see this in their own local community. I live in a very small town, and often the students in my local MYP program see the big picture stuff and they're really very clued in. But the same things are happening in our little town. We do have people who don't have a fixed address living out in the backwoods. Even here in Florida, we have kids that are hungry or homeless because rents here are really expensive. So there's a lot of contextualization that they can take from the big picture things that they're reading about in their language and literature courses, but also push them into the visibility in their own community. I love a lot of the conversations that are going on in the chat window. You're going to love it when you get to see the recording later on.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated to see how people are using it, because again, as I say, I don't have all the answers. In fact, probably don't even have some of the answers. But what I do have is, hopefully I'm able to prompt people to think and to maybe come up with ideas of your own. And the beauty then is in sharing them. And you know, this really does bring us into the last thoughts now of this session. You know, we've talked about what global citizenship is. It's about knowledge, skills, and understanding, right? These are things that we focus on. But it's thinking about what we do in class deliberately and outside class deliberately, because I don't think we can leave global citizenship to be something that happens accidentally on the playground because we have kids from all over the world learning together potentially, or from different cultural backgrounds learning together. It needs to be more deliberate than that. So I think, yes, students will catch it, but I think we must teach it. So how do we teach those skills? How do we ensure that students have the opportunity to develop the attributes and the skills? How do we ensure that the international issues or the global issues or the local and global contexts are there? And as I've said in the last few slides, I would argue that that is through the SDGs. And in an MYP structure, I think that is something we can do to boost the global context and the explorations. So I think in terms of the MYP model, if the whole goal is to develop international mindedness, then everything must operate together. The development of ATL skills through the approaches to teaching of inquiry, contextual, conceptual, teamwork, collaboration, etc. It all works together. And I think if we can infuse more of the SDGs as case studies and examples, then the MYP is a ready-made, beautiful model for developing just that. And I would be really intrigued at this stage for you to reflect. This picture, by the way, I just randomly got from the interwebs. It is not a picture of Middlesbrough, where I live in the northeast of England. Earlier, Chris actually did ask me if this was a picture I'd taken from my back garden. It isn't. Middlesbrough doesn't look like this. And if anyone here has been to Middlesbrough, you'll know exactly what I mean. But please do reflect now and have a think. And I'd love to know how you react to this. Do you think SDGs have a role? Do you think that what I've said actually doesn't work and is irrelevant? I'm very happy to be challenged, because only through challenging each other do we improve. And next, what do you think that you need to do now to make this work?
So actually, there's a really great question has just shown up in the chat window from Greg Perry, who is posing that kind of challenge. What do you say to folks who say that having this as a focus means teaching too little content? So what would be the sway on that?
I think that's a brilliant question. I think in terms of the content, again, if we think about the big ideas, what do we really want to teach? And I would start at the big ideas, the conceptual focus. And if we want to teach about issues that are really important, from sustainability issues through to peace and justice, and whether they are key concepts or not, these are important things. And we should be basing a lot of our units around these big ideas. I think that you can get the SDGs into many units, but I'm also pragmatic enough to, you know, I see the hint of where you're coming from. I'm also pragmatic enough to realize that sometimes it's force fitting. And for those of you who remember the good old days of the areas of interaction in the MYP, there was a lot of force fitting. A lot of interdisciplinary learning is forced. If it ain't there, it ain't there. So if you do have a particular unit and you don't see how you can contextualize it using an SDG, then don't try to do it, because we don't want to force SDGs without them being there. We also don't want to be teaching kids about SDGs. We want to be teaching through SDGs, which is far more authentic. You learn through the SDG so that a potential action is taken at the end. But yes, I take your point. We don't need to force it where it doesn't belong.
And Lena's been active in the chat window, and we've actually been having a little conversation about services action. Sometimes I find middle schools confuse that with the community project or the personal project, but that services action thread that has to weave its way through years 1 through 5 of the program. There's the reflection process. Some schools interpret it as do your 15 hours, check the boxes, turn in your paperwork. Where do you see that role coming in as well and fostering forward that global community and contextuality citizenship conversation?
World, yeah. And I think a lot of the inspiration for this comes from the work of Kathy Berger-Kay, who incidentally is a keynote speaker on the 17th of April at the Toddle Symposium. Be there, because Kathy Berger-Kay is absolutely magnificent and a great presenter. Chalk and cheese with this one, really. But what you want is for students to start thinking about and inquiring into an issue. And first of all, if you're introducing elements that come from any of the SDGs, be it from no poverty to life under water, so any of these, then students will start to think there's an issue here. And what you want is for something to come from them. There's an issue. What can I do? Our, life on land. There's the patch of land at the back of the school's a disaster. And remember, there used to be foxes there, and they aren't there anymore, or something like that, or the bird life's gone, or something. What can we do? And then we start with the investigation, which is the thinking of the 5 stages of service learning from Kathy Berger-Kay, which has an influence in the DP CAS, of course. Investigation, and then thinking, is there a need? Is something wrong locally? So you've been inspired by life on land, the SDG, which is a global issue, but then it's in a local context. That patch of woodland at the back of the school, something's gone wrong, or the local stream, there's something wrong. Now investigate, is there a problem? What can we do? Okay, so then start planning to do something, then take an action, reflect on your action, and then share your knowledge with other people. But it's come out of the curriculum. And I would argue that any of the SDGs, be it from social justice to gender equality to climate action, that you can start with knowledge and inquiry and investigating to taking an action. And that action could be a direct action, or more likely in COVID times, an indirect action or some advocacy. Just campaigning with families to take a particular action around a local woodland, for example. So that's how the local and the global connects as well.